Please be seated. Would you pray with me a moment? O Lord, our God, open my lips that my mouth might show forth your praise. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. O Lord, our home. Amen. Home. Home, I think, is one of the most evocative words in any language. I've told you before that I used to spend a lot of time in Iceland, and I would pass through there even more on my way to and from Scandinavia. And I remember one time as we were coming into land in Keflavik, and it was overcast as it always is in Iceland, but there was turbulence too, and the plane was shaking all over. And my experience was of these crossing lines in the graph. My fear was rising even as the plane was coming down, because I was looking out the window and I couldn't see the ground. And I thought, how much further can we fall before we hit? And then all of a sudden, we came out of the overcast and our wheels were instantaneously on the deck. Boom! And everyone burst out clapping. And the pilot came over the speaker and said, "Velkommen heim," welcome home. And I thought, I never hear anyone say that when we land in Logan. But for all the Icelanders on the plane, they were home. This word home, it calls up thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories and hopes and dreams and sadness. Home is both heaven and often hell. I really think that if neurologists were to study the brain, I bet you a really great part of the brain lights up when people are thinking about home. And then there are those of others for whom home hasn't always been so homey. And the amygdala would light up, that place of fear, needing to run away. The word home brings us to the heart of where the human experience happens. It brings us right into our lived truth, because the word truth means in accordance with reality. And our reality, if you really think about it, is shaped by, and then in turn shapes, our homes. It's the home that we come from that shapes how we see the world, and that we then later try to recreate. I think when we look into the world, one of the great human quests is to shape one little corner of the world into this place that says home to each of us. And the Bible, which is just a Greek word meaning book, is a book of truths. I didn't say facts, but truths. It's the story, as I said earlier, about home and homeless. It's the story of God and humanity's love dance. And in that story, home is one of the primary truths. It's one of the primary metaphors for truth, because home is symbolic of how we humans dance with God. And as I said, stories of home are central to that story. But the lack of home is the more prominent metaphor in the Bible. Right in the beginning, Adam and Eve, they've got this great home, and boom, they're out. They didn't read the rules. Gone. We meet Abraham and Sarah, and they're wandering around. And God's going to lead them, but it takes a lot of chapters. And they never actually arrived. The story of Exodus, 40 years in the desert, heading to a place that the people of Israel had never been. They'd all lived in Egypt for 400 years. They just remembered the memory of home. David, when he's on the run from Saul, hiding out in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Or the Ark of the Covenant, the law that God gave to the people of Israel, living in a tent until they could build a home. Babylonian captivity, where the people of Israel are taken from Jerusalem all the way over to where now is Baghdad. And they're not coming back. Not in this generation. Jesus, born in a shed in Bethlehem. They didn't come from Bethlehem, they came from Nazareth. They didn't know anyone there. Or all the stories about Jesus. He's not some farmer who people come to see in his farm or in his temple. He's a guy on the road, walking from place to place, staying where people will welcome him in. And when he is in Galilee, he's not in Nazareth. He's staying with Peter. He's staying with Simon. He's staying with the Syrophoenician woman. He's staying with Mary Magdalene. And the reason why the story of God's love dance has so much prominent use of the metaphor of homelessness is because in these stories, being without a home is a place of openness to God, to God's sovereignty, to God's grace, God's guidance, and God's dependence. Because, of course, when you're without a home, you cannot depend upon yourself. And oddly, for homed people like us, I like that, homeless, homed, the metaphor of having a home often means stuck, or fossilized, or far from interest in anything but doing what you did to have the home, as in not really that interested in God. You know, there's huge chapters in the Bible where it talks about Israel in the promised land. So from those instructions to what they actually did. And it talks about a self-satisfied people, a people who feel entitled, a people who think that they're special because of who they are rather than who their God is, a people who worship false gods, their prosperity, a people whose priorities are mixed up. Now, both of these metaphors, homed and homeless, are still both metaphorically but also actually pertinent today in our society, right now, in our Commonwealth. So let's start with homeless. Millions of our neighbors are either homeless or in acute danger of being homeless. And they live in a world of real stress and anxiety. And their homelessness is the nodal point of so many social concerns in our society today. Employment. How can you get a job when you don't have a home? Or you can't sleep well at night. Healthcare. It's hard to have health insurance when you don't have a job, which you can't have because you don't have a home. And so you go to the emergency room, which is what drives up the cost, which makes health insurance impossible for everyone, right? Education. It's hard for these children. I mean, my children each have their own room with their own desk and their own light and their own computer. And we have to go up and check to see if they're doing their homework. But these kids are on tables in Craft Hall trying to do their homework, with other kids running around. And the most important thing about a good home And by a good home, I don't mean the perfect home, but the best home that your parents could give you, is that there's a model of stability. Like you don't feel like mom or dad are going to disappear or have to move in with cousins and go somewhere, that we're going to be able to stay together. And so these children see that as their model for what's normative. Mom and dad doing the best they can. And so a lot of these people feel stuck, that the American dream is inaccessible to them, which is really hard, as Joanne said, in a place like the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, because they stay here, but they drive right by my house to get here, and they see me in my home. And it's like, wow, that's right there. I know I'm over here. But that brings us to the homed people. And let's start with the majority of people in homes in our country. Let's just start with the people who are less easily homed. For so many other millions of our fellow citizens and neighbors, being homed takes up so much of their income that they have little left over for food, or clothing, or medicine, or transportation, or education, let alone recreation. Things changed. In the 1950s, a guy with a high school degree could work in a Ford Motor factory and make enough to support his family. His wife didn't have to work. I know that sounds sexist, and it is from that point of view, but it was real. One parent didn't have to work. But now you need a college degree to make a decent income. But the parents of most of our neighbors can't afford to pay that tuition because they're paying mortgages. So the kids take loans. And they then can't afford to buy a home because they're paying that thing off forever and ever after they graduate. And so you have a whole nother millions of our fellow citizens who are living with real stress and anxiety. That they're doing less well than their parents or their grandparents did. That the American dream is no longer accessible to them. I may not be telling you anything you don't know, but it is important, I think. But then we come to us. People who live in a beautiful and exclusive community. And I say exclusive because of the cost of buying a home here. You have to have $1 million to move into Dover. And most of us move here from somewhere else. So we live a life where our roots aren't too deep. Home becomes the place where we're doing this stage of our life. As opposed to a few generations ago, where home was the farm where your family lived for multiple generations. Most of us live with our extended family, away. Grandma, grandpa, brothers and sisters, cousins, nieces, nephews. And for most of us, our old age is going to be spent in a place other than here. So we won't have the benefit of our longtime friends in our church. Right at the time when you want to go to church all the time because you're not going to soccer. And then there's so many of us, and I say this for me too. You know, I'm a solo pastor. So like you, we work long hours to cover the job that we have. So home often becomes a place to sleep, but we may not have time to connect with people in the community. Our homes are part of our identity, a symbol of our success, our solidity, our achievement. All of which puts enormous pressure on people in this town to keep up that symbol. Many of you who have kids came here for the schools. We certainly did when we were looking for a church. And you led the advertisement with best schools in Massachusetts. So we come here and we hope that our kids will maximize the experience, which means that we have houses full of stressed out kids. And then, and this is also me, I'm only talking about me here. Then you get really successful and you have more than one home. You have a home in Mashpee and you have relatives in France. And you go skiing in Colorado. Which means it's hard to be close-knit with the people who are left behind, who aren't with you in Mashpee or Nantucket or Colorado or France or wherever. And for so many of us, we only get to be part of church for 6 weeks in the fall and 6 weeks in the spring if our kids aren't in lacrosse or soccer or baseball. And I say all of that because I think that the top reason why people find their way through those doors into this place at the Dover Church is to find home. Like Cheers. I mean, it's crass. We couldn't use Cheers as our song, where everyone knows your name. You know, the bar down in Boylston Street. I mean, Kristen Dennison said it over stewardship. I love to be here because you people know my children's names. And yet so many of us can't find that depth because we're pulled in so many directions. What I'm saying is, home is where the human experience happens. I believe where we meet God, we find out who we are, and we are empowered to be who we might yet be. And all of us, the homeless, the less easily homed, and the homed, face real spiritual struggles around home. The Bible is a book of truths. All of us, I believe, are people who long to return to the Garden of Eden, who are like Abraham and Sarah on a long journey, we know not where, but towards God's promises. On an exodus, relying for God's guidance, living in a strange land, following Jesus on the road. If you come to help out the folks with Family Promise, more than a casserole or sitting with a kid on your lap, it's an opportunity to delve into these questions in your life. It's a spiritual practice. And I encourage you to join us. Amen. If you have are we going to do the offering and the prayers at the same time? Or just the prayers?